the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, December 30th, 2020. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, we have two great best-ofs from the same day this year, June 19th, 2020. We have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stop by this show right before her primary. I think this was like 3 or 4 days before the primary. Great opportunity to talk to her. Also talk about the HEROES Act, I believe it was, that had passed around that time. And then we speak to Professor Gerald Horne of the University of Houston on the celebration of Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day and Jubilee Day and Liberation Day, Emancipation Day. But he tells us the lost history of Juneteenth. And Emma, you, of course, were not with the show when we interviewed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but and correct me if I'm wrong, you were the first, if not the first person to sort of report on AOC's, at least, I guess on video for
nationally, I'd say.
Nationally.
I mean, I think, yeah, something like that.
We're close for the AOC when she ran that fateful primary against Joe Crowley, which she's got a minute. But I mean, what was that like? I mean, were people like, why are you doing this?
Well, yeah, I mean, we decided to spend an entire day with her, and we went to her apartment and we walked around her neighborhood, and I got to spend a good amount of time with her. I mean, there was no abbreviation of her name except she was Alex, not AOC, this like huge thing at the time. And I just remember thinking, okay, this person's legit. We had a really warm interaction, and I just felt like I knew her for a long time. And it was a really exciting moment. And then I got to be there on the night that she won the primary too, which nobody expected. But, I was there with Ryan Grimm and a bunch of the other TYT crew, and I'll never forget it for sure. Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to hear more about that. But I have to say, I've interviewed a lot of people running primaries. I've interviewed a lot of candidates, but over the years, but people who are running primaries against existing candidates, in general, it's their first time running for office. And some are, okay, some are good. But AOC had a natural talent even then, didn't she? Yeah. That was just... it stuck out to me 100%. And the only other candidate I've had that strong of a reaction to was Jamal Bowman. But I just think the two of them, in terms of candidates I've spoken to, just the natural charisma, the complete correct instincts to be on the right side of things, and also the strength. It was a really important moment in my life personally, or professionally, I should say. And I got to know her and people in her orbit too. So that's something I'll never forget. Well, I was very excited to have this interview as well. She did very few interviews prior to her primary. And fortunately, we were one of those. And I have to say, my level of coolness with my daughter, I think I mentioned this to her, went sky high when I told her I was interviewing AOC. All right, here is that interview again from June 19th, and we'll be back in just a moment. Hey, this episode is brought to you by Magic Spoon, and undoubtedly, my breakfast today was too. You remember breakfast cereal as a kid? Sugary, sweet. It colors your milk the color of it's chocolatey or fruity or frosty or blueberry. Remember how nice it made you feel, and
You ate it, and then you grow older and you realize, oh my God, I cannot believe it was legal to put that stuff in my body. Well, luckily, there's a way to relive the magic of your childhood cereal in a much, much healthier way. Magic Spoon is a cereal company that's discovered a way to recreate your favorite childhood cereals with 0 sugar, 11 grams of protein, and only 3 net grams of carbs in each serving. And now, because so many people asked, you can finally build your very own custom variety box where you can mix up all the different flavors they have. You can choose from the best-selling cocoa, fruity, frosted, and blueberry flavors, which are sort of knockoff versions of those famous kid cereals, plus brand new flavors, including peanut butter and cinnamon. I got to tell you, for me, I will mix the peanut butter and the chocolate or the cocoa. I will mix the cocoa with the cinnamon, and then I'll also have the cinnamon solo. That's the way I roll, folks. I am now eating cereal on a regular basis in the morning. I am eating it in the middle of the night, and my kids are eating it, and they're loving it. And that's what's, I got to say, that is worth its weight in gold, because it is keto friendly, it is gluten free, it is grain free, it is soy free, it is low carb, it is GMO free. And like I say, 0 grams of sugar. Tastes amazing. It is honestly too good to be true. They get the sweetness from, I think it's monk fruit extract. Man, who would have thought? Go to magicspoon.com/majority report. You build your own custom variety box. Try it today. Be sure to use our promo code Majority Report at checkout. You get free shipping. I have forgotten to do that, and believe me, it drives me nuts. Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they refund your money, no questions asked. Bingo, bango. That's magicspoon.com/majority report. Use the code Majority Report for free shipping. Use the code Majority Report for free shipping. I can't believe I said bingo, bango. But I want to thank Magic Spoon for sponsoring this podcast throughout 2020. I think they did it in 2019 too, but really, I want to thank them for also giving me a breakfast cereal I can eat that I can enjoy. So joining us now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's the Congresswoman from the 14th District in New York. Congresswoman, welcome to the program.
Hey, how are you?
I'm hanging in there. How are you?
I'm well, day by day.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I just read a report from Business Insider that says a bunch of Wall Street executives, including the co-founder of Blackstone, the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, the billionaire founder of Tudor Investment Corporation, have been pouring money into your race. What did you do to them that they're so excited to invest in your opponent?
You know, it's so funny because I remember maybe last year there was a Democrat who will go unnamed, was telling me that they were at a fundraiser last year in New York City, and there were all of these kind of Wall Street execs and private equity types, and they were fundraising for Democrats, and they had a kind of Q&A session, and they said that like a bunch of them were just asking about me. And this member told me, you know, I realized then that they're so freaked out over just one member not being beholden or predictable to them out of 435. And they're like, she's just one vote. Why are you so stressed? And this is why, because over the last year, we exposed big pharma. We've exposed the military industrial complex in very material ways that have cost them millions, if not billions of dollars. So they're coming after me.
Yeah. And I mean, let's just, I was just mentioning the biggest opponent you have. I mean, there's a couple in the race, but the one who has raised the most money after you is Michelle Cabruza Carrera. She has moved into your district after living apparently in Trump Tower. She was a former Republican. She had a plan in 2010 to privatize Social Security and Medicare, and had written a book with Larry Kudlow, of all people, back in more Sprite days for Larry Kudlow. So she is now, what her argument is that you are, you're not spending enough time in the district. Give me a sense of the district and where someone coming from that place, coming from Trump Tower, has an understanding of what's going on in the Bronx and part of Queens.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really rich, her kind of coming through with this accusation, given the fact that she's never lived here. And B, she just moved here 6 months ago. Maybe if she actually lived in our community, she would know that I'm home every weekend. And in fact, the only weekends that I wasn't really home in the district, which was about 4.4% of my entire time, only 4.4%, was when I was with Bernie on the campaign trail trying to get him elected. And so, which was just kind of, 4 or 5 weekends. And so, it's wild. But the thing that I think is really interesting is the narrative that she's running with, that I don't get along with the party enough, which is really, we have a Republican funded opponent who's running as a Democrat saying that I need to fall in line, which I think is just such a perfect encapsulation of US politics right now, which is that, there's more affinity and more of a relationship in terms of capital, in terms of big money, between kind of the more conservative elements of the Democratic Party and actual Republicans, then we actually have affinity structurally with progressives who put working families ahead of corporate interests.
Yeah, and actually, I want to get to that. Before we do, though, I want to talk just a little bit about. I guess this dovetails a little bit what your closing ad was, which was recounting the 3 crises that we are going through now, and in particular your district, which is in many respects, sort of like the epicenter within the epicenter on some level of all 3 of these crises that you listed. And but your response is that we need a systemic response, a systemic addressing of these issues as opposed to short-term fixes. Give me a sense of how you walk that line between both what you need to provide locally, but also dealing systemically means that you've got to do that almost in Washington.
Well, it kind of mirrors. It's all part of the same thing. So, for example, if we start with COVID and the economic crisis with COVID, along with the health crisis, on the ground, we started with mutual aid networks. So my campaign, we fundraised about almost $1 million, about $850,000 direct to district, directly to mutual aid organizations, which is kind of a radical form of social organizing with roots in the Black Panthers and even earlier with food assistance programs. And so instead of, trying to bankroll palm cards and whatever, during COVID, we started going directly into mutual aid networks, which is a completely unique form of organizing that is really built for moments like these, that is built on principles of community care and this idea that we do not need to be controlled by corporations in order to sustain ourselves. And then that kind of trickles up towards our models of legislation that we push. Those are the same principles that Medicare for All is based on. Those are the same principles that a lot of our legislation is rooted upon as well. The fact that we don't need to be reliant on corporate power in order to lead prosperous, healthy, and happy lives. So whether it's COVID, whether it's how we're structuring and dealing with mass unemployment, which, by the way, when you have corporate power consolidated to such an extent, you can lay thousands of people off at once because it's one corporation deciding that. But then thirdly, we have the issue of racism in law enforcement. And I represent Rikers Island, which is home to some of the worst atrocities on U.S. soil when it comes to mass incarceration. And really, it's not about the 4 walls of Rikers. It's about the entire system of punitive and the carceral state that creates a Rikers. Because you can close this Rikers, but if you keep the system open, a Rikers will pop up somewhere else in the country.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the at least the response to at least two of those crises, I guess, in Washington. That's the we've seen it in the context of the CARES Act, seen it in the context of the HEROES Act. You voted against CARES Act. You voted for the HEROES Act. First, let's talk about the CARES Act. Why'd you vote against that?
Well, the CARES Act it had some funding for hospitals, a couple billion for hospitals. It had no state and local, no relief for undocumented and tax-paying immigrants, and no relief for mixed status families. So those three in particular made the thing untenable, because if you're trying to contain a disease and you are not providing the economic means for the people who pack and deliver our food, the people who touch and deliver everything that comes to our homes, you don't give them the economic ability to stay home if they're feeling sick, then it's not a pandemic assistance bill. But the really important part of this as well is that while it had a couple bucks for hospitals and other forms of relief, it was not a relief bill with a corporate bailout tucked into it. It was a corporate bailout bill with relief tucked into it. It had $500 billion in unfettered money for Wall Street that was then being leveraged into $4 trillion, which is being completely unaccountable to, which has virtually no standards, and the oversight for it is a joke. This was a massive corporate giveaway and a huge restructuring of power in the United States. And we're really, while people are going to make a fuss about voting against it because it had a buck against a hospital and say, oh, you voted for $5 against a hospital, we are really going to see in the years to come exactly how we were betrayed by that aspect of this legislation.
Well, I think we've yet to even get the congressional committee that's supposed to be overseeing where that money went. As far as I know, they haven't even met at this point.
And it's going out the door already.
And that gets to sort of the next point I wanted to make, which was that we heard a lot about structural change in the context of the campaign, at least the presidential campaign, that has subsided a little bit based upon who is now the presumptive nominee. But it really does feel like the Republicans use this opportunity to create structural change that we're going to see down the road as, everyone's driving under the yellow flag, except for the corporations who get the green flag. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk about the HEROES Act, which was a message bill. Mm-hmm. You voted for this. What was the message of the HEROES Act? I know it was much bigger, but there was a lot of it seems to me that for a bill that everybody knew was not going to go anywhere in the Senate, that message seems very, very mixed.
Yeah, well, I do think that towards the end, while we were winding down on this bill, we started to hear from leadership this actually wasn't a messaging bill, that they actually are trying to negotiate this with McConnell, which we'll see. From what we're seeing, McConnell is basically sitting on the HEROES Act in the Senate and waiting for everyone's expanded unemployment to expire to use as leverage so that everyone is desperate, and then he can, push through something else that's terrible. But if it is intended as a messaging bill, I don't think it's a strong one, but I do think it tends to be the strategy of House Democrats, which is we're going to send a really strong message by packing in a bunch of things into a massive kind of omnibus style piece of legislation, when really, even in this moment, right, with police brutality, just repeal qualified immunity. I think that's a really strong message. Like, we just passed one bill that did one really powerful thing, and then maybe you pass another bill, and maybe you pass another bill. But the problem is really building those coalitions. So I think that's why these quote unquote messaging bills tend to be so watered down, because you don't actually have a majority of Democrats that are willing to do the strong message. So you have to cobble together kind of a huge package of legislation that doesn't necessarily meet the ends that we need right now.
But when I look at some of the things that we're missing, like no automatic stabilizers, right? I mean, that just seems like poor governance. I get the fact that the number would be big, but what's the difference between 3 trillion and 4 trillion, right? Nobody can conceive of either number. But Cobra, let's talk about this.
Don't even get me
Because, I mean, if this is a message, Bill, the message is we're going to provide for the American public the most expensive possible version of health insurance we can provide.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to have automatic stabilizers because that's going to look like it's too expensive.
Right.
But we're going to subsidize the most expensive and efficient way that we can provide health insurance. How do you, I mean, you voted for the bill. So, I mean, how do you justify that in that context?
Well, I do think that subsidizing Cobra is trash and it's horrible. For me, one of the tipping points for this and you know, for what it's worth, like it is, I'm just going to say it's a sausage factory in multiple ways. And so you have to decide which terrible things that you're going to have to, in any given piece of legislation, you're going to have to tolerate for other things. And so for me personally, the thing that was a tipping point in the HEROES Act was Democrats did do something unprecedented, and it was really hard to get them to do this, which was include ITIN payers, including immigrants and undocumented immigrants, and including mixed status families. Democrats are notorious for being very weak on immigration policy. We're terrible at it. And this is the first time that we've really seen relief on this level extended to farm workers, extended to, you know, Uber drivers, the people who are delivering our food, domestic workers, and so on. Anyone who pays an ITIN, which is millions of undocumented people, will get a stimulus check. And in the desperation of this moment, I think that was really important. But I don't think that absolves the legislation. And we really should be applying pressure on Democrats who think Cobra is better than just expanding Medicare to the unemployed. Cobra is horrible. It's terrible. It's a corporate giveaway. And even in addition to Cobra, we also had two options, which was Pramila Jayapal's Paycheck Guarantee Act, or it was this like payroll tax deduction. And they went with like a payroll tax deduction that just a small class of employers would feel a year from now, which does not help our situation right now. Whereas Pramila's bill guarantees paychecks and also helps people transition from unemployment into employment without getting without getting a financial hit with the expanded UI. And so, you know, I think it's embarrassing, but at the end of the day, there is a corporate consolidation of power. There's a very strong corporate wing in the Democratic Party that we have to continue to organize against. And we are starting to expand that power.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about how that works. I mean, right now we're watching a race in a district next to yours in the 16th. Jamal Bowman is doing very well against Elliot Engel. I mean, we can only tell so much at this point. We're going to know more, obviously, at the end of day Tuesday. But it seems to me that is sort of been that's a little illustrative of what you're talking about here, right? Chuck Schumer just jumped in to endorse in that race. Like, why is Chuck Schumer that excited? Why is there this level of, you know, you mentioned, you know, why is Wall Street going after you? Your one vote. You're in, you know, like, do they really expect to have a Wall Street crony representing the Bronx? Why is there this much? I mean, are we seeing like a fight against progressives for the sake of saying we're going to beat progressives, as opposed to like, we need Elliot Engel in there because we need that vote against the next bill, the next deal against Iran?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there is kind of a disproportionate ire aimed at progressives. But I mean, maybe that's just me talking personally because I am one. But I also think that, you know, 2 years ago when I won against Joe Crowley, it was kind of an emperor has no clothes type of moment. And I think that people got extremely concerned because he's not the only one that is in that type of position. Because the thing when it comes to corporate power, especially in the Democratic Party, is that there's more of us than there are of them. And by that, I mean, there are more progressive voters and people in the Democratic Party, our policies are more popular than there are numerically of people who support corporate policies. And I said it back then, and I say it now, we've got people and they've got money. And in order for this kind of corporate hegemony to sustain itself, it requires Democrats in deep blue seats to support things like payday lenders, Wall Street brokers, private equity takeovers, etc. And that's been the big secret all along, right? Where if you can combine these deep blue seats with representatives that support Wall Street, that is the tipping factor. Or, it's not just Wall Street, it's our prison industrial complex, it's our military industrial complex, all of these fingers of the same hand. And so the key is these deep blue seats supporting these atrocious policies that are supported by payday lenders and all of these folks. And once you kind of get a crack in that, it gets very, very scary for a lot of these deep blue Democrats that are supported by those same interests. And so, I think that there's that, and also seniority in the House is a whole different ballgame. And so people want to protect those kind of the structural and procedural power where that derives. And so all of that kind of combines for the protection of policies and kind of this center of the universe that is these very well-funded, kind of least representative interests.
So, is that part of the strategy? As you look, obviously, I think you're in a position that I think very few, frankly, freshman Congress people have ever been in, for that matter. You have an ability to fundraise that challenges people who have been there for decades. You have name recognition that is, in many ways unparalleled. So when you're thinking about how to build these coalitions, is going for those blue state Democrats in those deep blue seats who are, in your words, if I understand what you're saying, basically providing cover for the rest of the caucus to move to the right because they're ostensibly in the deepest blue seats. Is that part of the theory? Go after those and turn those first?
Well, I think that those seats tend to be very accessible for the progressive movement, right? It's accessible to the progressive movement. It's a lower lift in resources because it's already in our pocket, right? Whereas, yes, I believe that you can swing a seat with a progressive candidate. Absolutely. But it also costs $15 million to do so for one vote. Whereas you can run, we can better use our small dollar resources, take that 10 million, scatter it around other seats. And then even if you don't end up, if that candidate doesn't end up pulling through at the end, you still get a dramatic shift in the incumbent's behavior as well. And that should not go ignored either. When I was running against Joe Crowley, he all of a sudden, I announced that I was going to run for Congress from behind a bar. And I was behind a bar working brunch at a coffee shop when I found out that he signed on to Medicare for All like a week or two later. And so then he started co-sponsoring all of these progressive policies just by the fact that I was running, even when I hadn't fundraised anything yet. And so I think it's more, you kind of get more bang for your buck in that sense, but it also takes very good progressive candidates, and I think that that's something that we need to be disciplined about as well. It's not just, it's not just about supporting any person who just rolls through and slaps a bunch of progressive policies on their websites. It's about, does this candidate have a history in the community? Do they have a context, a cultural, racial, socioeconomic context for the community? Have they served in any way? It doesn't mean that, have you worked yourself up the ladder of electoral politics, but Jamal Bowman is a school principal for 20 years. Like, he knows these families, he knows these kids, and he can effectively champion these policies in a way that, it is more than, social media is an incredibly important role, but it also goes much deeper into kind of this candidate service. And, is there a real deal here? Is there a history here?
Right. All right. So lastly, last question for you. once you've, with the dust settles and we get a House, after the 2018 election, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Democrats take the presidency, they take even the Senate. What do? You got 40% of the Democratic caucus is progressive. How do you work that inside game and make, there, at least there's a plurality there, right? What's the strategy to assert more progressive power within the caucus where there clearly seems to be some breaks on that?
Yeah, I mean, and we even have to be careful when we say 40% of the caucus is progressive as well, because there are moves that are made where the progressive caucus actually has no entry standards. Like, in order to join the progressive caucus, you don't have to sign on to you don't have to be a co-sponsor of Medicare for All. You don't have to be a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. There's no kind of, you don't have to not be financed by corporate PACs. Like, there's no real pledge. You just kind of pay the caucus dues and you're in. And so as a consequence, there are a lot of these deep blue Democrats who say they're part of the progressive caucus, but actually aren't pushing progressive policies behind closed doors. In fact, they work against them. And so for us, I think it's still a continued, there needs to be like real continued pressure on progressive movements and those folks that say that they are progressive, because 40% is a lot. And even if we're able to expand that majority in the House, which I believe is also possible, now we're talking about making real movement. And so I think it requires a lot of outside pressure, but inside, we're going to have to also work a lot on supporting the standard bearers and uplifting them in positions of power. Barbara Lee ran for chair of the Democratic caucus, and she was essentially kind of undercut by a more conservative wing of the party. And so we really need to have our inside game in terms of uplifting and making sure that we're surging some of those progressive standard bearers in the same way that we also have an outside game. Because when you have, Pramila Jayapal or Barbara Lee or any one of these progressive leaders, Ilhan, Ayanna Pressley, et cetera, pushing on whether it's decarceral policy, whether it's healthcare policy, whether it's, foreign policy and beyond, we have to make sure that we've got their back and that we are keeping attention to the inside fights as they are happening. Because so often the reason we lose them is because folks realize that votes happen after they happen, whereas corporate elements of the party are very well attuned to what the business that's on the floor. And really that 48 hours before a vote is the most important 48 hours in determining the outcome.
They've got the resources to sort of do a little more advanced planning, as it were.
That's right.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck on Tuesday. Really appreciate it. We're big fans here. My daughter is a huge fan, and I have now become much cooler in her eyes. So
Tell me to say hello.
I will. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And so there it is, my interview with AOC. And I was really interested to see how frank she was about elements of the HEROES Act, particularly Cobra subsidies, because that is just an inexplicable, inexplicable from both a policy and a practical standpoint why you would support that. All right, we got to take when we come back, we're going to be talking to Professor Gerald Horne of the University of Houston on the hidden history of Juneteenth. On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Professor Gerald Horne. He is the professor of history and African American studies at University of Houston, and the author. His latest is coming out in July, The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm looking forward to your new book. I remember when you were on last time, and like I say, I can't remember if it was in 2019 or 2018, but you had said that you basically had covered, in some ways, that book is the prequel to your the last book that we had you on for, which was, if I'm not mistaken, gosh, I lost it, but it was like the apocalypse. We were full in the apocalypse, the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and that was in the 17th century. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about Juneteenth. I think people know maybe a little bit of what Juneteenth is about. That it marks a day, June 19th in 1865, when essentially the Emancipation Proclamation was read in, I think it was Galveston, Texas. Tell us more about just the basic facts of this holiday.
Yes, and first of all, the 16th Century book is now out, so you give me your address, I'll send you a copy. But in any case, with regard to Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army shows up in Galveston, Texas, off the coast of Southeast Texas, not far distant from Houston, Texas, from where I'm now speaking. And according to the traditional story, tells the enslaved that they're free. Recall that the Civil War had ended in April 1865, a couple of months earlier. But even though I support the move, and of course, there's just been a bill introduced in Congress to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, and corporations like Twitter have stolen a march on Congress by granting their employees Juneteenth as a day off, and I support that wholeheartedly. But the story is actually a bit more complicated than that traditional narrative. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation coming into effect in January 1863 did not necessarily apply to areas where the United States did not exercise effective sovereignty. And that certainly included Texas, a bulwark of the so-called Confederate States of America that seceded from the United States in 1861 in order to perpetuate slavery forevermore. And then secondly, there was this lingering feeling among slaveholders in Texas that if the Confederacy collapsed, Texas, which after all had been an independent country between 1836 and 1845, and only joined the Union in 1845 because it was under so much pressure from British abolitionists and other global abolitionist forces. And so if the Confederacy collapsed, Texas had this idea that it would rejoin Mexico, from which it had seceded in 1836 because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery in the 1820s under a president of African and indigenous origin. Speaking of Vicente Guerrero, you may celebrate Cinco de Mayo here in the United States, which is a major holiday for people of Mexican origin, which marks a clash between Mexican forces and the French puppet forces under Maximilian. Maximilian, of course, had given a warm embrace to the Confederate States of America. And so the idea was for Texas to rejoin Mexico under Maximilian. But fortunately, what happens is that the Mexican people, in league with Black soldiers, I should add, including George Washington Williams, who was an early Black historian, collaborate to squash Maximilian, leading to his execution, of putting paid to this diabolical idea of extending the lease on life of slavery that these Texas enslavers held dear. However, I should say that unpaid labor for Africans did not necessarily end magically in June 1865. It continued for some time. How long is unclear. And certainly a kind of neo-slavery arises to take its place, speaking of the convict lease system, whereby Black men in particular were arrested on a flimsy pretext and then leased en masse to the same plantation owners who supposedly had freed them on June 19th, 1865.
So if I hear you, your I guess ambivalence is a function of people misunderstanding exactly what happened at that moment, and that Texas was really this isn't about Texas pride, and it really isn't in many respects about a status change of sorts for Black and African slaves at that time.
Well, I'm not ambivalent at all. As noted about Juneteenth, I salute those who are pushing that as a national holiday. I particularly absolute West Coast longshore, which as we speak are shutting down ports from Seattle to San Diego in solidarity with Juneteenth, in solidarity with the idea that this should be a national holiday, and in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I'm only questioning the traditional interpretation, which I think makes rather simple and smoothed over a very complex and complicated history, and in some ways lets the enslavers off the hook, because independent Texas was a major slave trading force. Galveston was a major slave trading port.
Right.
That is to say that the Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Africa, with the kidnapped then brought to Galveston, oftentimes transshipped to Cuba. One of the reasons you have so many Black people in Cuba is because of the manic energy of these Texas slave traders. They would also ship Africans to Brazil. That is to say, the slave vessels would sail straight from Texas, from Galveston to, say, Angola, load up the ship with kidnapped Africans and take them across the South Atlantic to Brazil. And so a lot of that history gets sort of smoothed over when you just talk about, General Granger shows up and tells the Negroes they're free, and then they begin to celebrate.
Right. Well, now, so let me ask you this in terms of like the development of the marking of Juneteenth, as opposed to the, let's say, I don't know, the day that the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. Like, I mean, how, why, and I hear you that, like, the end of the process, as it were, and I don't know that we're, really fully completed this process, but the end of the process, at least in the context of the official Emancipation Proclamation, regardless of what what's happening on the ground per se, would have been in 1865 as opposed to 1863. But what does it mean to celebrate that day as opposed to the day of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, first of all, the train has left the station with regard to Juneteenth. I think it's too late to claw back that particular date, particularly since Congress is moving forward. Black organizations wholeheartedly endorse Juneteenth. It's marked, I believe, in 47 different states and in the District of Columbia. We expect Hawaii to join the 47 sooner rather than later. And so I think that the importance is having a day on which there is a solemn remembrance of the horrific nature of slavery, and then using that process to connect the horrors of the past with the carnage of the present, recently seen on the streets of Minneapolis, the streets of Atlanta, Staten Island, and too many other bloody sites, too numerous to mention. That's important. With regard to Emancipation Proclamation, you may know that many historians, particularly Black historians, have been revising their opinion, shall we say, of Emancipation Proclamation. This idea that it did not apply to areas over which the Lincoln government had jurisdiction, such as Maryland and other states that controlled slaves but did not bolt into the Confederate States of America. So it did not apply to them, but it applied to states where they did not exercise meaningful sovereignty, such as Texas. That seems a bit slippery, too clever by half. And so I understand why people are reluctant to hang their hat on the Emancipation Proclamation.
And my understanding is that the first Juneteenth was actually celebrated the next year in 1966. Is that right? I mean, excuse me, 1866.
Well, sure. And as we speak in southeastern Texas, there are going to be many remembrances. I mean, it's a grassroots project. I mean, and I think this is how things should work. It's a project that came from the grassroots, that came from below, that is to say, from Black people themselves, and then it's adopted by others. It's adopted by Twitter, it's adopted by other corporations, it's adopted by states in the District of Columbia, now introduced into Congress. And to me, that's a model of how we get a day off that's paid.
Right. But I mean, is it, I guess, and I guess, a part of having, and part of the reason why I wanted to have a historian such as yourself on is, in some way, as that, this is the most prominent, I think Juneteenth has been, at least in my lifetime. And I think a lot of that is a function of what's going on in the streets right now. But we're the speed in which it's being subsumed by what you're talking about, the corporations, and 25% off on all furniture this Juneteenth. I mean, I don't know how far away we are from that. Seems to be, maybe it's just it's just the nature of our society today, but having it be interpreted properly and celebrated properly seems to be hugely important. And it's almost like, it's also, it's shocking that that it hasn't really occurred to the society at large to celebrate this, particularly. I mean, I've come to understand through, frankly, from your work and others, in looking into Reconstruction, much of what happened, much of the America that we live in today is formed in those, in really those years from 65 to, 75. I mean, the Reconstruction has at least set up a template for our civil society today. It's sort of shocking that we don't have anything to sort of commemorate and to make people consistently aware of it.
Well, if the 45th president were on the line, I'm sure he would intervene and say, as he said in the Wall Street Journal today, that actually the popularity of Juneteenth has a lot to do with himself. He says that when he decided to have this rally, this is going to take place in Tulsa tomorrow on June 20th. He originally was June 19th. He said he brought a lot of attention to this idea and helped to thrust it into the spotlight. And so you may want to give him a shout out or give him a pat on the back as a result of, say, the rooster helping to bring the sun into the sky in the morning, for example, by crowing. But in any case, you raise a very serious question as to the fact that slavery oftentimes goes unremarked in the United States of America. I remember in 2007, when Britain was marking the end of Britain's role in the African slave trade, 1807, the 200th anniversary in 2007. Then Prime Minister Tony Blair spoke, the Queen spoke. It was a big deal. It went totally unremarked in the United States of America, even though, of course, the United States of America was a major slave trading nation. It was even the recipient of many of the enslaved brought on English and British vessels. And I think there's a certain level of discomfort with slavery in this country because it tends to disrupt the immaculate conception theory of the creation of the United States, that creation myth that sees the creation in 1776 as being flawless and perfect. Of course, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize just recently for an essay in August 2019, marking what she said was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans, where she suggested that slavery had something to do with 1776. And of course, all hell broke loose. The establishment historians have begun to attack her in scurrilous terms and actually haven't stopped to this very day, which I think is unfortunate because, as many leading historians have said, our obligation to history is to frequently rewrite it and frequently reinterpret it because different generations oftentimes have different historical needs. And I think that that's what's happening today as we speak. A younger generation is looking for an interpretation of the past that helps them understand the present. And I think a lot of the past interpretations, they help to bolster a kind of liberal narrative, which put liberals in the forefront of the struggle, and I guess made them feel good about living in the United States, and it tended to downplay indigenous dispossession, and tended to basically indicate that there were more people involved in the abolitionist movement than there actually were. And so now people are looking for an explanation for Trumpism. I mean, how did we reach the brink of catastrophe? How did we reach this precipice? And this sort of overdetermining of liberalism as being the motive driving force of the creation of the United States doesn't fit with Trumpism, who, as of today, we cannot say this force will be defeated on the first Tuesday in November. So I think that reality is crying out for new interpretations. And I think also that the Black community is crying out because the Black community is trying to explain this carnage in the streets, trying to explain this pornography of violence captured on tape that's leading to lynchings in public, with officers of the state nonchalantly executing this grisly task while staring into the camera as if they were taking a walk in the Sunday park.
Right. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, just to because I really do feel, I mean, that I am personally, in terms of like my understanding of history, has changed dramatically over the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I would say, based around the question of race in this country. I think I've said in the past, I think it's Carol Anderson's White Rage, I think sort of just was one of the pieces that came together for me to see that there's a real continuum here. I mean, and I think that's what you're suggesting, is that, we need to reevaluate history to get a sense of exactly how we, our estimation as a society of what paths we took have been, do not jibe with where we have ended up on some level. And it suggests that maybe we didn't follow the map that we thought we followed. Do you think, with that said, do you think that there is a danger in looking at slavery as a binary? I mean, slavery is in and of itself is binary on some level, but the forces behind slavery, the societal context in which slavery is created, is not binary. In other words, that like you get the Emancipation Proclamation, then you get this it read in Texas. But if I remember correctly, the general who read it basically said, like, incidentally, not much is going to change. Like, you got to go work and you can't really get paid that much. And that those forces, just because we said slavery ends, those forces that constructed slavery continued on to construct other functions that in some way function in the same way that slavery did. Does that make sense?
Well, certainly convict lease system, which I've already made reference to, was a kind of neo-slavery. And I think there's always a danger when one seeks to reinterpret history, because the interpretation may not stand up. I mean, to give you an example, historians, whether they acknowledge it or not, they start off with a theory of the case. I mean, for example, I'm doing a book on Texas as we speak, which is why a lot of this material is fresh in my mind. And so part of my theory of the case was with regard to collaboration between the enslaved African population and the indigenous, particularly the Comanche. So when I'm going through documents, I'm taking notes on that. But then what kept popping up on my in the documents was the enslaved population collaborating with their masters to a degree against the indigenous population. Now, the way historians usually work, they stick with their theory of the case and they don't take notes on something that does not comport with their theory of the case. But I felt compelled, and I do feel compelled, to try to explain that what I consider to be a kind of anomaly. And it was an anomaly because the collaboration with the indigenous was much more prevalent. But the lack of collaboration, it seems to me, deserves an explanation. And I think that that's been part of the failing of the historical establishment, is that they have this theory of the case and they stick to it. And then I think that leads to misinterpretations. I mean, for example, Oregon in the 1850s, when it enters the Union, says no Negroes allowed, no slavery allowed. Now, the historians oftentimes say, oh, Oregon is anti-slavery. Well, yeah, but they also don't want any Negroes, period.
Right.
Free are slaves. And it's the same with Georgia in 1733, when it becomes a settlement, a British settlement. It says no Negroes allowed, no slavery allowed. Now, the historians stick to the latter. Georgia comes into being as anti-slavery. So how do we explain this anomaly of it becoming a major slave state. Well, just refer to the fact that they said no Negroes allowed. So certainly there's a danger with interpreting and reinterpreting history, but I think those dangers can be avoided with certain kinds of clear methods.
Okay, so and I got to tell you, I'm super excited to check out the Dawning of the Apocalypse, your latest book, and we're going to have you on for that. But give me a sense of how do we celebrate, aside from with the hopes that next year, maybe in the years to come, folks will have the day off on Juneteenth. How do we celebrate? I mean, has there been any sort of concerted attempt? Was there in 1866? Was there were there means in which to specifically, I don't know, traditions or whatnot? I mean, in my own sort of sense of things, Passover as a holiday is to celebrate the emancipation of the Jews from Egypt, essentially, and we have very ritualistic things. But how, within the context of Juneteenth, are there other things that and if you were in charge, are there some that you would want us to adopt?
Well, it's just like the King holiday, which I think has been revisioned as a day for volunteer service, for service to humanity, by working in soup kitchens, by registering people to vote, and the like. With regard to Juneteenth, I think that historically it's been a day of solemn remembrance. It's been a day of reflection on how this catastrophe was unwound, speaking of slavery. And I would like to see an extension of that tradition. Once again, I think that if we are to ever understand these eruptions from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and in fact globally over the past 3 weeks, you really have to understand slavery. And once you begin to understand slavery, as Michelle Bachelet, the leader of the United Nations Human Rights Council, announced the other day when they had these hearings on, quote, systemic racism, unquote, in the United States of America, with the brother of George Floyd addressing the body in Geneva, Switzerland, Michelle Bachelet not only called, she's a former leader of Chile, as you know, the president, she not only called for a repairing of the torn fabric of Black American society and ultimately U.S. society by dedicated means of reparations, and she did not limit it to the United States. She also spoke about colonized Caribbean, colonized Africa, etc. And so I would like to see Juneteenth being a day for rededication to what Michelle Bachelet has already articulated. That is to say, helping us to understand this carnage in the streets and helping us to try to forestall a further eruption of carnage in the streets.
Gerald Horne, thank you so much for your time. We'll put a link to your newest book at majority.fm and look forward to having you on to discuss it.
Fantastic. And have your aides send me your mailing at your postal address and I'll send you a copy.
I will do. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Professor. And so there it is. 2 interviews that we did from June, back when it was warm and sunny out and we could go outside. And,
yeah.
There was a little more socialization going on at that time for all of us. Hopefully everyone is staying safe. We've got a couple more days of these best ofs. Emma, I hope you're gearing up for a very calm New Year's.
Yes, I'm going to sit in my apartment and do nothing.
Okay, well, we will be back tomorrow with 1 or 2 more best ofs of the year. We'll see you then.